Welcome to the U.S. Manufacturing Today podcast, your hub of information about the U.S. manufacturing and distribution industry. Brought to you by Variable, the on-demand labor solution revitalizing and optimizing your operation, enabling just-in-time response to demand, more efficient production, and lower cost per unit. And now your host and head of reindustrialization at Variable, Matt Horine.
Welcome back to U.S. Manufacturing Today, the podcast powered by Variable, where we talk with the leaders, innovators, and changemakers shaping the future of American industry, along with providing regular updates on the state of manufacturing, the changing landscape, policies, and more. Today, we're happy to welcome back a previous guest and a familiar voice in this space, Rosemary Coates, as the founder and executive director of the Reshoring Institute. Rosemary has spent 25 plus years helping companies evaluating sourcing decisions, manufacturing footprints, and supply chain risk. She now leads the nonprofit dedicated to bringing cost-effective manufacturing back to the U.S. and has posted several times on LinkedIn about some of the current events and some of the insights that we're seeing from executives in the sector. Today, we're going to go a little bit deeper. What is happening now in U.S. manufacturing, what policies, what actions, and what hidden risk are executives still missing? And how do we turn the reshoring movement into a full-blown industrial movement and not just a blip? Rosemary, welcome back to U.S. Manufacturing Today.
Thanks. I'm delighted to be back.
Well, we're excited to have you. We had a great episode last time. We got a ton of insights. So there's been a lot that's gone on in the intermittent 6 months, and we're excited to dig into it. You've been at this reshoring issue for years now. What's really changed in the past 6 months and 12 months? And are we in a moment of acceleration, or is it just kind of gathering headlines right now?
If you'd asked me, is manufacturing coming back, I'd say yes and no. Isn't that a great answer?
Yes.
I love it. Yeah, we've been doing this we're going on 11 years now that we've been around helping companies evaluate the decision to bring manufacturing back. And boy, we've been through a lot of ups and downs. It was lukewarm for a few years. And then after the pandemic, we saw a lot of spikes where companies were earnestly trying to redevelop manufacturing in the U.S. And then in this past year, of course, with all the various tariffs and so forth, it has caused a lot of consternation and I think certainly increased costs and so forth. What we're seeing is right now, companies are not investing. We just don't see a big movement to invest in American manufacturing. And I think that's because of the uncertainty in the environment and the uncertainty with respect to the tariffs. And we are seeing a lot of companies exiting China and going to Mexico. So those are the two big trends. And so I would say some's coming back. We like to say manufacturing went out like a tsunami and is coming back in raindrops. There's some good news stories, but not anywhere close to what was touted as happening when the big tariffs were put into effect a few months ago. There was speculation that all this manufacturing would come back, and it's just not. And that's the truth.
Right. No, I think there's a lot more that goes into it, like on the ground, right, than some of the design. And there's certain elements of it that will take effect over longer range. And a lot of the times what we've asked guests on the show is, what does the 5 to 10 year outlook look like? Because as you know, kind of rooted in realism there, it does take a lot of time. And I think your insights were backed by a recent post that I saw from you on LinkedIn, where you referenced some executive responses to your supply chain shocks, or how it was framed. And what stood out most from that research to you?
Yeah, so we were engaged by the state of New York, their economic development folks up there, that were trying to figure out how they help their manufacturing clients. And so they asked us to do this survey. We actually surveyed 18 executives all across America, not just in New York, but all across America, in the Midwest, in the West, in the East, everywhere. And we asked them, these were all C-level executives, and we asked them some simple questions. How are you responding to the tariffs? What are you doing? And what are your plans for the future, essentially? And to a person, they told us they were doing nothing, these were all pretty much mid-size to bordering on large industries, but they told us they were just not investing, not hiring, because of the uncertainty of the environment. They just didn't know how to plan for the future. And they weren't willing to put $1 billion out there to build a new factory when they were unsure of what was going to happen tomorrow, right? What are they going to wake up to tomorrow? Or could they depend on the future that they would have a positive cash flow in these factories in the future? So they were in a holding pattern. And by and large, I think that's really stuck for the last 6 months or so. And it's not that these companies don't want to invest. These executives told us they were very anxious to rebuild manufacturing in America and start sourcing more in America. But there's just too much uncertainty to know what to do. And I think that's reflected in the economic environment today, which is very sluggish. The economy is very sluggish. We're seeing unemployment rates tick up. All of these things are reflective of what they told us. Now, however, they were almost all planning in the background. So what they told us is they were not doing anything right now, but they were making plans for the future. So would they invest here or would they move around the world? And that's significant. I would say in the 40 years I've been in industry, especially in the early 2000s, most of my clients told me, just get me to China. We know it's cheaper and all our competitors are there and just get me to China. And in today's environment, that's no longer the case. It's where in the world should we manufacture? Not just get me here or there. And there are so many more variables that are taken into consideration than there were back in the early 2000s. So now these same executives are saying, find me a low-cost environment, but we also need to consider the geopolitical risks. We want to mitigate risk in our supply chain, so we want to have multiple suppliers, multiple locations. There's a big shift in consumer bodies, groups of consumers around the world. There's still growth in Asia. So you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot and rip everything out of Asia either, if that's your growth market, and the growth in Mexico. And I think Mexico is the one big constant in everything that we heard in our research and what we see going on is that companies are very interested in moving production to Mexico.
That is a really interesting trend. And we've heard a lot about, the nearshoring movement and having, kind of two things. One, the geopolitical uncertainty around China, which is, obviously there's kind of that long march mentality there that we see as a geopolitically opposed for some type of hegemony, and Mexico much closer and with renegotiated trade agreements like USMCA and maybe whatever comes out of the tariff talk. So it's certainly a valuable and reliable alternative, it seems like in the near term. But from your institute's work, and I think what we've seen over the past several months, there are things that have kind of shifted around. What are some of the other policy levers that policymakers at the state level or at the federal level could consider in conjunction with tariffs? Because that's one thing that we talked about on this podcast is whether it's right, wrong, and different, it seems like we're moving out of a globalization era into an era of some type of multipolarity or some type of regionalization or some type of fully reshored movement, which, those things will play out over time. But what are some of the other policy levers that you're seeing or where people are finding the wins?
Yeah, first of all, I guess I would start by saying that we don't have an industrial policy in the U.S., which surprised the heck out of me. I didn't know that till a few years ago. But unlike other countries, France, for example, is heavily supportive of the aerospace industry. Mexico, industrial development, different products in Central America, very focused on apparel and that sort of thing. So the government supports those industries and the development of those industries. In the U.S., we have no policy like that. So the funding and the way the government supports us is dependent on legislation and what is in the budgets. For example, under the Biden administration, there was the CHIPS and Science Act and the Infrastructure Act, which provided funding that helped manufacturers. And if that's a policy measure, but there's no stated goals by the U.S. government to support this industry or that industry, other than we know we need to support semiconductors, for example, pharmaceuticals, some of these batteries, rare earth elements. These things are top of the list for us to continue to look at and focus on. And our government needs to, I think, step up and support those kind of industries. Now, all that being said, we are trying to move production back to the U.S. in all kinds of industries, not just those top four. And there is lukewarm movement, I would say. Companies that we've spoken to and those that we work with tell us that they'd like to manufacture here if they could make the economics work. But when you look at, there's some components of that. You've got wage rates, you've got infrastructure that's got to be there, you've got electricity. These things are availability of workers. These things are critical to supporting manufacturing. Let's take it as an example, the electrical grid. I spoke with an investment banker a few weeks ago from New York in the power sector. And he said to me, he asked me, he had read something that I wrote, and he said to me, "You really think manufacturing's coming back?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm optimistic about that." And he said, "I got to tell you, we don't have the infrastructure, the electrical infrastructure to support it. So even if we wanted to have 1,000 factories come back, we don't have the electricity for it. And not that we can't build that in 10 or 15 years, but it's not here right now. And so it's not going to happen in the near future." So that's one example. And of course, we know about worker shortages, although with the unemployment rate ticking up, that may be eased a little bit. My guess is that we don't have workers with the right skills to do the work. And we don't have people that are willing to sit on a plastic bench for 10 hours a day and assemble iPhones or assemble running shoes or that sort of thing. That's not the kind of manufacturing that we have ever had in the U.S. and not the kind that's going to continue here. So there are a lot of those kind of issues. So what's happening with companies is they're rethinking this global idea. Do they move production out of China to Vietnam or Thailand or Indonesia or some other place in Asia? Or do they try to bring some back here and automate the processes so they can take that labor out of it and so forth? We did another study recently. We just published it in the last couple of weeks. It's up on our website. And it's a comparison of labor rates in Mexico to those in the U.S. Wow. I was surprised. We looked at cross-border cities, pairs, so San Diego and Tijuana. In San Diego, the minimum wage is $17 and I think 25 cents an hour, something like that. In Mexico, just across the border, it's like within a couple of miles across the border, the wage rate is $2.59 per hour. When you look at differences like that, it's obvious if you have a lot of labor content in your product that you need to look for a low-cost environment like Mexico.
Right. No, that makes a lot of sense on some of the lower end manufacturing. And I think we talked about that in your last episode. You may have been the one that highlighted it first on our show about the power issue and the power grid issue. I see a lot of folks talking about energy infrastructure and what needs to be built and what needs to be done there. I think there's all kinds of talk about alternatives like nuclear and other things that takes time and is certainly not something that we do in the next 90 days or 6 months. So that makes a lot of sense. For a manufacturer that is considering it beyond just, the labor or the tooling or the logistics, what other pitfalls do you usually see? Is it primarily around labor? Because we, at Variable, we work on, kind of this fragmentation or this idea that it's about labor access. There's a lot of pools of people. We had a guest on a couple of weeks ago, Nurit Cohen, who talks about the future of work and how that is, I use the term gig economy very loosely, but people looking or tapping into these access pools. China has done that on an industrial scale. There was a great book out recently about, Apple in China and how they basically mobilize people from the countryside into the city. So they're doing it at the scale of millions. So labor access for us is certainly something that we talk about all the time, and we believe we have a solution for that. But what other key things are there? I think that textiles come to mind, and not just making smaller items for apparel or those types of things, but kind of the intricacies of what it takes to manufacture in the modern age.
Yeah, for sure. So I like to say that we don't necessarily have a labor shortage; we've got a skill shortage. And today's manufacturing environment is full of computers. If you're working in a manufacturing site, you probably have to move things, inventory along on a computer system. You have to note if there's a quality issue on a computer. These are different skills from 50 years ago when, there were no computers, right? So the shop floor looks very different today. And then the other component, of course, is the development of AI. We're going fast forward to implement AI in so many situations in manufacturing that if you don't have AI skills, you don't have the proper skills to do the work. It's really a skills problem. We need to focus on training our workers, not just trying to put them to work, fit them into positions where they don't have the skills to be successful. So that's a huge issue. I think community colleges have stepped up to fill that gap. Even writing an email. So community college, in order to get a degree, you have to take some basic writing classes, and these are important for even being able to write an email properly in a business environment. That's a different skill from just ordinary manufacturing, putting pegs in holes. And then, of course, robotics is the other component, not only AI, but the use of robotics in a manufacturing environment. At least workers need to learn how to operate a robot and to repair a robot, not necessarily to do the work. So those are different kind of jobs.
Right, absolutely. I think we've talked about that a lot here, about how that augments, the worker. It's not something that if people said that 10 years ago that automation was going to take, manufacturing jobs, or AI was going to take, all of it seems to be built around the worker and making them more efficient and effective, which is great and hopefully true. But, one of the other big things, and I think I saw this in your article recently, I think it was through Business Facilities. It was talking about, tariffs and other things, but highlighting specifically, there was a case study of about 12,000 U.S. companies that specialized in stainless steel processing. This was from an article a few months back. And so, that's the big question, right? Like, people don't know if supply exists. It appears to exist. What holds companies back, specifically from the existing structure? Is it cost structure? Is it margin protection? Is it local access? I think you said earlier. What is the big one for you?
Yeah, I think it's a mindset difference. So nothing is static in manufacturing. It's all moving forward. What we were doing 2 or 3 years ago is not the same as what we do today. So you have to be constantly looking forward and understanding what are the new tools? How do you implement things? What's the environment like? It's a constant barrage of variables that the manufacturing management has to deal with. And there's no getting around that. You have to learn to be flexible, to make decisions based on the current environment and the current variables that are out there. And that's the way you get to be successful. And that may mean all kinds of different directions and different tools and different implementations.
No, that's a really good point. And I think that, one other thing that's really encouraging to our listeners, because you have worked in this space, you were talking about reshoring long before, what we're talking about these days, which is reindustrialization, which is kind of different than moving the supply chain. It's actually a good industrial-based strategy. I've heard the industrial strategy from a couple of guests. Is there a case study of a company that reshored successfully from your organization's point of view? And, what were the pillars to that? You've obviously worked with a lot of them. And I'm sure not all of them are a clean 100%. Yep, we took the manufacturing out of China. We put it back in the U.S. Labor was not a problem. Supply was not a problem, those types of things. But what's, a really good example of that over the past decade?
Yeah, I think my favorite example is GE Appliances. When Jack Welch was CEO of GE, he pretty much gutted the manufacturing in the U.S., moved it all overseas. And that's the way he achieved these high financial results. That was the strategy, and the results were spectacular in terms of financial results. When Jeff Immelt took over, he challenged the engineers to find products that they could, in fact, manufacture in the U.S., and they developed a GeoSpring water heater. This was maybe 10 years ago or so. And that water heater was a heat-on-demand water heater, a high-end, the kind of thing you would see in high-end housing and other places. And they were quite successful. They re-engineered the production line. They put people back to work in Kentucky, and they reopened the plant there. It was a great success story, and they've continued on down that road. So they continue to find in other plants around the U.S. opportunities to bring manufacturing back to serve the local market. And that's through re-engineering the factory floor for high efficiency, for the introduction of automation, for really looking at the financial profile of manufacturing in the U.S. and where their customer base is. So that's been a big success story. Although what I would say is the backbone of American manufacturing is not GE size. That's right. It's smaller companies that don't have those kind of resources. And those companies are making decisions based on the current environment, the labor rates, the availability of workers, was energy available? What's the price of energy? I mean, all these things go into the pot before they make a decision on what to do.
No, that makes a lot of sense. I think, one other big thing to kind of pull back and look at the macro level of this, and I think it's probably everybody who's at the table, whether it's folks who are trying to bring reshoring back, whether it's through tariffs or other policy levers or those, types of decisions that are made by any administration. But the nature by which we do that and how it ties into what's becoming very clear around this picture of national security, economic sovereignty, and first mover advantage in a decoupling world. A lot of times we say we make a decision, we make a left turn, we make a right turn, but we've made the turn, right? And so that is over the next 5 to 10 years, it certainly looks like a trend towards decoupling from the order that was probably established over the past decade. Certainly, pandemic timeframe accelerated that. People viewed it through the lens of just supply chain and maybe not industrial base. And now we're looking at industrial base. So the winds are moving that direction if they're not already. How does all of that tie, and how do you see getting wins in stages over the next couple of years and into the next decade and perhaps the next couple of decades?
Yeah, I'm very optimistic and hopeful that we will, in fact, to reindustrialize the U.S., but it's got to be industry that's appropriate here. And that is highly automated, sophisticated manufacturing, not the 23-cent an hour t-shirt production. We don't want that back, and we wouldn't have workers to be able to do that here. We couldn't afford it. And so that kind of production belongs overseas in a low-cost environment. Here, I think we're going to look more at, over the next 2 years, at considering North America as a whole group, a combined group. Having some manufacturing in low-cost Mexico areas, I think, is probably the biggest trend that we see. But specifically because if you are making something that's the product and the raw materials and the labor of Mexico, you potentially could bring it in under USMCA duty-free. Now, USMCA is going to be renegotiated next year. There may be some changes there, but even with that, I think it's still an opportune environment. What I definitely see are people want to move out of China. I think we have really damaged the relationship with China in the last few years, and there's a general feeling that we should get out of China and not help them anymore to develop. But like I said, if you have a market in Asia, which is a growth market all across Asia, you might consider another low-cost place in Asia to manufacture. So what I think we're seeing is that companies are attempting to rebuild in the U.S., or I would say in North America, more likely. And there are hurdles to get over, as well as a heavy investment that's going to be required if you make anything in the U.S. So you just can't compete if you have a lot of labor in the U.S.
That makes sense. I know we've talked about on this show the textile industry specifically, and obviously completely inverted over the past several decades, where we used to make, I think in 1970, it was something like 97% of all of our clothing was made in the United States. And obviously, back then, a lot more labor intensive, and where the automation and other things have gotten it to is what used to take 10 workers now takes one worker who's upskilled that can also maintain a wage rate. So you're not bringing back 10 workers, you're bringing back one per automation. So that, obviously there's some type of hope there, and that we can source our goods, but it changes with the labor market because you're not employing the entire manufacturing town like you did in years past. So hopefully that trend can kind of continue.
Yeah. I would also say you have to look at the textiles and apparel. Textile is different from apparel. Apparel requires a lot of effort and labor and so forth. And I think you have to segregate that industry, because we do see apparel coming back on the high end or smaller companies, the smaller brands and so forth that can handle manufacturing here that have higher margins. So more sophisticated brands. There are some companies that are manufacturing their goods here now at last. What we're not going to see is the t-shirt production or the low-end clothing and apparel that's sold at places like Walmart and that sort of thing. That requires a low-cost environment in order to maintain those low-cost prices, those low prices. So you can't make generalizations about apparel and textiles. you have to segregate it into what are you talking about within that industry. And textiles are completely different. Textiles, the fully automated process. If you've ever been in a textile plant, there's nobody there. It's just a lot of machines, right? There's a few engineers walking around tweaking things, but it isn't labor intensive at all. It's very capital intensive. That's a good example of understanding where you are in the marketplace and what the profile of your company is.
No, really good insights and definitely a differentiation there. I think it speaks to the nature of how automation can be a potential path for reshoring, in a lot of ways, and how in other, sectors of that, there's potential to bring back labor in some capacity, but certainly not something that people have used it for margin protection and cost drive down, right? If that was the point of the product, which we see with fast fashion companies coming out of China, things that ship on Temu and Shine and those types of things, it's designed for a consumer market that expects those low prices. And that's where tariffs have probably seen the impact from the consumer side, which is, hey, we flood the market with that kind of cheap material. That's what happens when, geopolitical winds kind of shift a little bit. But this is the part of the show where I probably ask for, your expertise and advice. If there are manufacturing leaders listening, if you had to name one action a manufacturing leader could take this quarter to move from some type of, kind of generalization to real reshoring, what would it be? And that's at the executive level, obviously, but also, how does it impact their organization?
Yeah, I think because of the stagnant nature of investment and what's going on right now, if you had to do something this quarter, I would say try to redevelop your supply chain in the U.S. As manufacturing went offshore, all the suppliers did too. In order to reestablish a supply chain in the U.S. to get your components and raw materials, you have to redevelop it. It isn't like you can just call up somebody and say, okay, now I need this. These manufacturers have to redevelop that manufacturing process in the U.S. So I would say that's the immediate need, is to work on redeveloping your supply chain and sourcing in America.
Really great advice and something that's been recurring on this show. Rosemary, if you want to tell us a little bit about your organization, in case this is the first time somebody caught one of our episodes with you on it, we now have 2. Where can they go to find out more about your organization and what you do?
Yeah, we have a really huge website with a lot of content. It's reshoringsintute.org. We're a nonprofit and nonpartisan organization, and we publish all of our research. We are affiliated with now 20 universities. And we take interns from these universities and they help us with our research. We publish everything on our website. And I think that's the place to go. It's www.reshoringinstitute.org.
Excellent. Well, listeners, be sure to check out Rosemary's website and the Reshoring Institute. Thank you for coming back and joining us on the show, Rosemary.
Thank you.
To stay ahead of the curve and to help plan your strategy, please check out our website at variableops.com and under the resources section titled Trump 2.0, where you can see the framework around upcoming policies and how they will impact you. If you're on socials, give us a follow on LinkedIn, X, Instagram, or Truth. And if you're enjoying the podcast, please feel free to follow the show on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube and leave us a rating, and don't forget to subscribe. Thank you again for joining us and learning more about how you can make your way.